Could this be the moment the United States tips the balance of power in the Caribbean, turning a regional standoff into a global flashpoint in September 2025? Three powerful Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, a stealthy Los Angeles-class submarine, and an entire amphibious group surged into waters near Venezuela, backed by more than 4,500 Marine sailors and aviators. The Pentagon insists the operation is routine, but its scale suggests otherwise, with President Donald Trump demanding stronger enforcement of regional security and an end to what Washington calls destabilizing activities by Caracas. This deployment looks far more like a calculated show of strength than a simple patrol. The centerpiece of this naval formation includes the USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Sampson. These destroyers are the backbone of American sea power, armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets with pinpoint accuracy over 1,000 miles away. Each is fitted with the Aegis combat system, one of the world's most advanced radar and missile defense suites. Together, they create a defensive shield that could intercept enemy aircraft missiles and even ballistic threats before they reach the fleet. Experts from Jane's Defense Weekly note that this combination of destroyers alone would be enough to overwhelm the Venezuelan Navy, which lacks comparable firepower or electronic warfare sophistication. Lurking silently below the surface is the Los Angeles-class submarine, a vessel built for stealth and precision. Its ability to remain undetected for weeks at a time makes it an intelligence-gathering asset as well as a strike platform. In recent months, Russian submarines have been active in the Atlantic as part of Moscow's ongoing pressure campaign linked to the war in Ukraine. Analysts at Defense News suggest the U.S. submarine's presence near Venezuela is not only about Caracas, it is also a message to Moscow and Beijing that Washington can project covert power in contested waters thousands of miles from home. But the true hallmark of this deployment lies in its amphibious component. The USS Iwo Jima, a Wasp-class assault ship, has been joined by the USS San Antonio and USS Fort Lauderdale. These transport docks and amphibious carriers can rapidly land Marines' armored vehicles and helicopters on hostile shores. In the words of retired Admiral James Stavridis, an amphibious-ready group is the foundation of any serious intervention plan. Paired with the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, this force has the capability to seize beachheads, secure key infrastructure, and establish forward operating bases within hours. Supporting these vessels is a network of aircraft. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol planes sweep the skies and seas, hunting submarines and relaying real-time intelligence. Rotary wing helicopters extend the reach of the amphibious ships, while fixed-wing aircraft provide close support. Combined, this arsenal creates a layered present surface warfare from destroyers, stealth from submarines, rapid landing from amphibious ships, and surveillance from the skies. The result is a force capable of dominating every domain, sea, land, and air across the Caribbean. What makes this moment especially significant is what the deployment does not include an aircraft carrier. Instead of overwhelming firepower, the US Navy has opted for speed flexibility and multi-purpose readiness. Analysts at the BBC point out that this choice mirrors America's posture in the Indo-Pacific, where small but lethal naval groups patrol contested waters around Taiwan and the South China Sea. The strategy is clear show that the United States can strike swiftly without committing its largest assets unless escalation demands it. Meanwhile, Venezuela has scrambled to respond. President Nicolas Maduro has ordered the mobilization of air defense batteries around Caracas and naval units along the coast. Reports from Reuters confirm that Venezuelan Sukhoi fighter jets have increased their patrols over the Caribbean. Yet the imbalance is glaring. Venezuela's navy numbers only a handful of outdated frigates and coastal patrol craft, no match for America's modern destroyers. Experts at The Guardian argue that this standoff could tempt Caracas to lean more heavily on support from Russia and Iran, both of which have vowed in 2025 to expand military ties with Latin America as a counterweight to US influence. The stakes extend far beyond Venezuela itself, with NATO reinforcing its eastern flank against Russia and Israel, bracing for escalations with Iran. Washington's ability to project power in the Western Hemisphere becomes both a reassurance to allies and a warning to adversaries. As DW notes, the symbolism of this move cannot be overstated. While Europe struggles to keep Ukraine supplied and the Middle East simmers with missile exchanges between Israel and Tehran, the US is demonstrating that it has not taken its eye off Latin America. Yet this raises the central question: is America's buildup off Venezuela a deterrent designed to warn Maduro and his allies, or is it laying the groundwork for something more aggressive? If the latter, the presence of amphibious-ready groups and Marines suggests Washington has the muscle to do more than just watch from a distance. So as these ships cut through Caribbean waters and Marines stand ready to move ashore, the world is left asking, is this truly about routine operations, or is Venezuela about to become the next battleground in a global contest of power? What happens when a heavily armed superpower positions warships just beyond a nation's shoreline? In Caracas, the answer was swift. Venezuela mobilized, signaling that any breach of its sovereignty would be met with force. Within days of the U.S. Navy's arrival in Caribbean waters, the Venezuelan armed forces activated coastal defense systems, deployed troops to strategic positions, and ordered increased air patrols. Officially, Washington insists the ships are operating in international waters, yet the unmistakable implication is clear: this deployment is directed at Venezuela, and President Nicolas Maduro knows it. The Venezuelan Navy, though small, scrambled frigates and patrol boats attempting to monitor U.S. movements. Fighter jets, primarily Russian-built Su-30 flankers, roared over the Caribbean skies in an unmistakable show of defiance. State television broadcast images of missile batteries stationed near Caracas intended to signal readiness against any foreign incursion. Still, analysts agree the balance of power is overwhelmingly one-sided. A senior fellow at the Atlantic Council described Venezuela's defense as symbolic at best, noting that its naval assets would struggle to survive even the opening salvos of a U.S. strike led by Tomahawk-equipped destroyers. Domestically, Maduro has used the crisis to consolidate political control, portraying the U.S. presence as evidence of imperialist aggression. Massive rallies in Caracas denounced American interference, while state media amplified claims that Washington aims to seize Venezuela's oil reserves. Reuters reports that Maduro's allies in parliament are now drafting legislation to deepen military cooperation with Russia and Iran, both of which pledged in 2025 to increase their footprint in Latin America. Moscow recently announced that it may send two 160 bombers for joint exercises with the Venezuelan Air Force, while Tehran hinted at the possibility of deploying drone technology similar to the Shahed 136 that have shaped the war in Ukraine. On the ground, however, morale in Venezuela is uneven. Years of economic crisis, hyperinflation, and sanctions have strained the armed forces. Desertion remains a problem, and spare parts for advanced Russian jets are scarce. The Guardian reported in August 2025 that only half of Venezuela's Su-30 fleet remains fully operational. This reality places Caracas in a precarious position. It must project confidence to its population and allies, but privately commanders know their arsenal is no match for the scale of U.S. firepower currently positioned offshore. At the same time, regional neighbors are watching closely. Colombia, long at odds with Maduro's government, has quietly welcomed Washington's presence. Officials in Bogotá argue that the naval buildup deters cross-border smuggling and prevents Caracas from threatening Colombia's security. Brazil, meanwhile, has taken a more cautious stance. President Lula da Silva has called for de-escalation, warning that military confrontation could destabilize the entire continent. According to BBC coverage, Brasilia has pressed for urgent talks within the Organization of American States, highlighting the risk of a wider regional conflict. The timing of this crisis could hardly be more delicate. Globally, conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East are stretching military resources and testing alliances. In Eastern Europe, Russia continues its brutal campaign while NATO braces for long-term deterrence costs. In the Middle East, Israel and Iran remain locked in tit-for-tat missile exchanges, with Washington committed to backing Israel militarily. Against this backdrop, the United States' ability to deploy thousands of troops and advanced warships to Latin America demonstrates a remarkable show of global reach. DW's military analysts point out that the Venezuelan crisis is not isolated. It is a theater within a larger contest where America must simultaneously reassure allies and deter adversaries across multiple continents. Inside Venezuela, the narrative is one of survival. State propaganda frames the standoff as a David versus Goliath struggle, rallying nationalism even as food shortages persist and inflation erodes household savings. International observers warn that this rhetoric risks spiraling into miscalculation. The more Maduro escalates his language, the harder it becomes for him to step back without losing face, warned a former U.S. diplomat in comments to The Guardian. This mirrors dynamics seen in Moscow and Tehran, where leaders frame U.S. moves as existential threats, limiting their own diplomatic off-ramps. Washington, for its part, appears committed to a calibrated posture. By avoiding the deployment of an aircraft carrier, the US signals that this is not a full-scale invasion plan, at least not yet. Instead, the focus is on amphibious readiness and deterrence. Still, the amphibious group's presence gives President Trump options ranging from humanitarian landings to full-on seizure of strategic oil terminals. Military planners emphasize that the line between deterrence and preparation is thin, and both Caracas and its allies will treat the deployment as potential groundwork for intervention. As the standoff hardens, the question becomes, will Venezuela's mobilization remain a symbolic gesture, or could it trigger a chain of escalation leading to a clash in Caribbean waters? Why did the United States choose this exact naval package, one that combines destroyers, a submarine, and amphibious assault ships, while deliberately leaving out an aircraft carrier? The answer lies in strategy. Every element of the fleet was carefully selected to send multiple messages both to Venezuela and to the world. According to a September 2025 report from Defense News, Washington aimed to showcase rapid response capability without escalating to the full might of carrier strike groups, which would signal an outright invasion. In other words, the US Navy tailored this deployment for maximum deterrence with calibrated escalation potential. The three Arleigh Burke-class destroyers form the spearhead of this strategy. USS Gravely, USS Jason Dunham, and USS Sampson are built to control the sea's neutralized missile threats and deliver precision strikes. They are not just warfighting platforms, they are signals of American dominance in maritime technology. Each ship embodies the US ability to track hundreds of airborne or seaborne threats, simultaneously creating a defensive wall no regional navy can pierce. In contrast, Venezuela's outdated fleet, still reliant on legacy Soviet designs, cannot even approximate such firepower. Experts from Jane's Defense Weekly argue that the US deliberately highlighted this mismatch to dissuade Caracas from testing American resolve. The inclusion of the Los Angeles-class submarine adds another layer of complexity. Stealth unpredictability and psychological pressure are its main contributions. A submarine that cannot be seen but is known to be lurking transforms naval operations, forcing adversaries to commit resources to constant vigilance. Analysts at the BBC note that Venezuela lacks serious anti-submarine capabilities, meaning this single US submarine is functionally untouchable in the Caribbean theater. The mere suggestion that it could launch cruise missiles against command centers in Caracas introduces a deterrent factor disproportionate to its size. Then there is the amphibious component. The USS Iwo Jima, USS San Antonio, and USS Fort Lauderdale represent a different kind of message. America has the means not just to monitor or strike Venezuela, but to land troops on its shores if ordered. This projection of amphibious power is especially provocative given Venezuela's dependence on coastal infrastructure for oil exports. By stationing Marines offshore Washington reminds Maduro that the US could choke his regime economically and militarily with a single order. Retired NATO commander Admiral Mark Ferguson told Deutsche Welle that the presence of an amphibious ready group, especially paired with a Marine expeditionary unit, is the clearest signal short of an actual invasion that the US is prepared to act decisively. Interestingly, the absence of an aircraft carrier is itself strategic messaging. Carriers represent overwhelming force projection, capable of launching dozens of fighter sorties per day. Not deploying one suggests the US does not yet see Venezuela as a theater requiring that level of commitment. Instead, Washington seems to be practicing what Western analysts call scalable deterrence. This is the art of showing just enough military capability to keep adversaries off balance without committing the kind of assets that would imply an inevitable conflict. This choice also resonates with global dynamics in 2025. In the South China Sea, US Navy carrier groups are tied up deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan. In Europe, carriers are on standby to reinforce NATO allies facing Russia's continued assaults in Ukraine. By deploying a smaller but lethal package to the Caribbean, Washington demonstrates that it can juggle multiple flashpoints simultaneously, an important reassurance to allies, but also a warning to Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. The scale of this deployment also raises economic and political considerations. With global oil markets rattled by Middle Eastern tensions, Venezuela's reserves have become more strategically significant. The Guardian highlighted that even whispers of US naval intervention pushed Brent crude prices up by 5% in late August 2025. By maneuvering this fleet near Venezuelan waters, the US not only pressures Maduro, but also exerts leverage over global energy markets, a move that directly impacts European and Asian economies already strained by sanctions and conflict. From a NATO perspective, the US operation in the Caribbean demonstrates alliance-wide reach. European partners see it as proof that Washington remains engaged outside of Ukraine despite mounting defense costs. Yet critics warn this also stretches US forces thin, raising questions about sustainability if multiple crises escalate simultaneously. America's strategic messaging is effective, said Dr. Michael Clark, former director of the Royal United Services Institute, in an interview with the BBC. But the danger is that adversaries may gamble on US overextension, especially when Trump is already juggling commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The takeaway is that this deployment is not random. Every ship, every aircraft, every Marine on board was chosen for a reason. Together, they craft a message of dominance, deterrence, and readiness, carefully balanced to signal strength without committing to war. Yet, as with any military signaling, the risk of misinterpretation is real. Caracas may view the amphibious force as an imminent invasion threat, while Moscow and Beijing may see it as another front in a global contest. Which raises a critical question: will America's finely calibrated show of force be understood as deterrence or misread as preparation for war? What if this deployment is not simply deterrence, but the first stage of escalation? Military planners are now openly considering scenarios in which US forces go beyond patrols and posturing moving, instead into active operations against Venezuela. The presence of amphibious ships, submarines, and destroyers is not coincidental. It is the exact configuration needed for an invasion plan should the order come from President Trump. The first option would be a limited strike. US destroyers armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles could target Venezuelan radar air defense sites and command centers in a matter of hours. This approach would neutralize Caracas' ability to coordinate its response and create air superiority for US aircraft. Western experts point out that in Syria, similar strikes crippled military infrastructure with minimal risk to US personnel. A Defense News analysis published in September 2025 suggests that this decapitation light option would give Washington leverage without requiring troops on the ground. The second scenario would be an amphibious landing. The USS Iwo Jima and accompanying transport docks are designed precisely for this mission. With the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit embarked, the US could deploy thousands of Marines' armored vehicles and helicopters to secure Venezuelan ports or oil facilities. Such a move would not only deliver a crushing psychological blow, but also cut off Maduro's regime from its most critical economic lifeline, crude exports. Analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly stress that Venezuela's coastal defenses are outdated and unlikely to withstand a determined US landing force. However, they warn that urban combat in Caracas or Maracaibo would be bloody, prolonged, and politically risky. A third, more extreme possibility is a joint regional campaign. Colombia, already aligned closely with Washington, could provide land bases and logistical corridors. If coordinated, US forces could strike from sea, while Colombian troops applied pressure from the border. This dual-front approach would stretch Venezuelan defenses thin, yet it carries enormous diplomatic consequences. Brazil and other Latin American nations would resist any campaign that resembles regime change, fearing a repeat of past US interventions in the hemisphere. Escalation is not limited to Latin America. Russia and Iran have both pledged to support Caracas. Moscow could funnel weapons intelligence or even deploy aircraft to Venezuela, just as it has stationed assets in Syria. Iran, with its proven drone warfare capabilities, could provide Maduro with kamikaze drones similar to those used against Ukraine. In fact, Reuters reported last month that Iranian trainers were spotted in Caracas, advising Venezuelan units on drone operations. If these systems were activated in a conflict, they could threaten US bases in the Caribbean or even civilian shipping lanes. China's reaction would be subtler but no less consequential. Beijing has long invested in Venezuela's oil sector and could leverage economic pressure or cyber capabilities to retaliate against Washington. Analysts at Deutsche Welle note that the Chinese Navy's presence in the Pacific could increase pressure on Taiwan if Washington becomes entangled in South America. In this way, a US-Venezuela clash could cascade into a global chain reaction, touching nearly every major flashpoint of 2025. The risks of escalation extend to energy markets as well. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world. A blockade strike or invasion would jolt global supplies at a time when Israel and Iran's missile exchanges are already destabilizing Middle Eastern exports. The Guardian estimates that even a 2-week disruption in Venezuelan shipments could send global oil prices soaring above $150 per barrel, triggering inflationary spikes across Europe and Asia. That economic weapon, whether intentional or not, would affect NATO allies, partners, and even adversaries alike. President Trump, known for his blunt approach to security crises, has framed the U.S. presence as a matter of regional stability and American strength. Still, experts warn that rhetoric and reality often diverge. Once you deploy Marines on amphibious ships within striking distance of hostile shores, you create momentum toward action, said Dr. Lawrence Friedman, a British defense analyst, in comments to the BBC. The danger is that deterrence morphs into intervention almost by default, simply because the forces are already in place. The question then is whether Washington can maintain this delicate balance. One miscalculation, whether a Venezuelan pilot buzzing a U.S. destroyer or a drone striking too close to American forces, could ignite a spiral from which neither side can easily retreat. The Pentagon's own history in Iraq and Afghanistan serves as a warning. Quick operations can snowball into prolonged commitments with heavy political costs. So the looming issue becomes unavoidable. Is the United States prepared for a short, sharp intervention, or could it stumble into another protracted conflict, this time in its own hemisphere? How are America's allies and adversaries responding to this buildup near Venezuela, and what does it mean for global security in 2025? The reactions tell a story of deep division in Latin America. NATO capitals Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The deployment has been interpreted through the lens of wider geopolitical rivalries. Colombia has been the most supportive, long plagued by cross-border tensions with Caracas. Bogotá has welcomed the U.S. naval presence as a deterrent against Venezuelan incursions. Colombian officials told Reuters in early September that Washington's move strengthens regional stability and offers reassurance that Maduro will not escalate aggression. Quietly, Colombian forces have stepped up exercises along the border, suggesting they are preparing for contingencies should conflicts spill across frontiers. Brazil's response is more restrained. President Lula da Silva has emphasized diplomacy, calling for urgent talks within the Organization of American States. According to the BBC, Brasilia fears a U.S. intervention could ignite unrest across the continent, recalling decades of Cold War-era meddling in Latin American affairs. Mexico has voiced similar concerns, warning against actions that might destabilize regional economies already reeling from inflation. Beyond the hemisphere, NATO allies in Europe are watching with mixed emotions. On one hand, the U.S. deployment reassures partners that Washington is capable of projecting power simultaneously across multiple regions, despite ongoing commitments in Ukraine and the Middle East. On the other, European governments worry that stretching U.S. resources could undermine NATO's eastern flank. DW reports that several defense ministers quietly questioned whether America could sustain heavy operations in both Eastern Europe and Latin America if crises deepen simultaneously. Adversaries, however, have seized on the deployment to harden their positions. Russia, embroiled in its ongoing war in Ukraine, has portrayed the U.S. presence in the Caribbean as evidence of Washington's imperial ambitions. Moscow's foreign ministry announced it would strengthen military technical cooperation with Caracas, hinting at weapons transfers. Western intelligence suggests Russia may send additional advisors to Venezuela, echoing its playbook in Syria. This move serves a dual purpose. It ties down U.S. attention in its own hemisphere, while reinforcing Moscow's narrative that America is overstretched and vulnerable. Iran's reaction is equally significant. Already clashing with Israel in an escalating cycle of missile strikes, Tehran views Venezuela as a potential partner to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere. Al Jazeera reported that Iranian officials recently discussed supplying Venezuela with long-range drones, a move that could threaten U.S. bases in the Caribbean. If deployed, these systems would mirror the tactics used against Ukrainian and Israeli targets, showcasing Tehran's growing reach. China's stance is more calculated. Beijing is Venezuela's largest creditor and a major buyer of its oil. Rather than military moves, China is leveraging economic tools. According to The Guardian, Chinese state oil firms have quietly increased contracts with Caracas, signaling support against U.S. pressure. Strategically, Beijing benefits if Washington is forced to focus on Latin America, as it potentially eases American attention on Taiwan. Military analysts suggest China could escalate maritime maneuvers in the South China Sea to exploit any U.S. distraction. The broader impact on NATO cannot be ignored. With Washington projecting power in the Caribbean alliance, members are reminded that the U.S. remains indispensable for global security. Yet this reassurance comes with unease. A European defense official quoted in Jane's Defense Weekly put it bluntly: if the U.S. commits heavily in Latin America, NATO must prepare for scenarios where Europe stands more alone against Russia. The possibility of parallel crises, Russia pressing Ukraine, Iran targeting Israel, and the U.S. confronting Venezuela, illustrates the strategic strain America's allies must now consider. Energy markets are another front where reactions are felt sharply. Even speculation about US military action in Venezuela sent oil prices climbing. European economies already strained by reduced Russian supplies now face the risk of disruption in Venezuelan exports. For Asian markets, particularly China and India, the threat to Venezuelan crude introduces another layer of volatility. Financial analysts at Reuters estimate that sustained tension could raise global energy prices by as much as 20% before year's end. This global ripple effect underscores the core reality the US move in the Caribbean is not just about Venezuela, it is part of a broader chess match in which every move reverberates from Bogota to Brussels, from Moscow to Beijing. And while allies may welcome deterrence, adversaries are sharpening their tools, ready to exploit any opening created by American overreach. The pressing question for the international community is this: will these reactions stabilize the situation by restraining US options or push Washington and its rivals into a dangerous cycle of escalation? Is this massive US naval operation a mere show of force, or the first act of something far more consequential? The ambiguity is deliberate. Washington wants Caracas, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran to wonder whether these ships are there simply to monitor or to strike. Yet history teaches that such ambiguity carries danger. Deterrence can just as easily slip into confrontation. For President Trump, the timing is critical. With tensions rising in Ukraine, Israel's clashes with Iran intensifying, and China testing boundaries in the Pacific, America cannot afford to appear weak in its own hemisphere. Deploying destroyers, submarines, and amphibious forces near Venezuela underscores that the US retains global reach even under heavy strain. According to a September 2025 BBC analysis, this move sends an unmistakable message: the Western Hemisphere remains under American watch, regardless of commitments elsewhere. But signals can be misread. Venezuela has framed the deployment as an imminent threat, rallying domestic audiences with nationalist rhetoric. Russia has pledged military technical support, Iran has teased drone deliveries, and China has deepened its economic lifeline to Caracas. Each of these responses narrows Washington's room for maneuver, locking all sides into a tense standoff. The more Maduro portrays the crisis as a fight for survival, the harder it becomes for him to compromise. The Amphibious Ready Group, with its thousands of Marines, represents both reassurance and risk. Reassurance for allies like Colombia that America will not abandon them. Risk because its very presence creates pressure to act. Former NATO Commander Admiral James Stavridis warned on DW that when you place that kind of capability in theater, the temptation to use it grows stronger by the day. The absence of an aircraft carrier may indicate restraint, but the flexibility of amphibious forces makes escalation more likely should any clash occur. For NATO, the deployment illustrates both strength and vulnerability. Europe sees proof that Washington can operate in multiple theaters, but also worries about overextension. With Russian artillery still pounding Ukrainian positions and European economies dependent on stable energy flows, the specter of a US conflict in Latin America raises fears of strategic overstretch. Allies privately ask, if the US commits to Venezuela, will it still have the bandwidth to deter Russia in the Baltics or China in the Pacific? Meanwhile, energy markets and global politics are already feeling the shockwaves. Oil prices climbed after news of the deployment, reflecting concerns that Venezuelan exports could be disrupted. This comes as Middle Eastern instability already squeezes supply. Analysts from The Guardian argue that Venezuela's oil reserves make it not just a regional player, but a global pressure point. By flexing military muscle near Caracas, the US is effectively putting its hand on one of the world's largest spigots. The unanswered question remains, is this the endgame or just a rehearsal? If it is a show of force, Washington may succeed in deterring Maduro while avoiding escalation. If it is a prelude to intervention, then the world could soon witness the opening stages of a conflict that reshapes Latin America and reverberates across Europe and Asia. And in either case, the US has already reminded both allies and adversaries that it holds the power to shift the strategic map with a single naval move. So viewers are left with a stark dilemma. Is this deployment a masterstroke of deterrence or a dangerous gamble that could ignite a new front in an already unstable world? The U.S. naval deployment off Venezuela in September 2025 represents one of the most significant shows of force in the Caribbean in decades. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, a stealth submarine, and an amphibious ready group with thousands of Marines form the backbone of a calibrated yet potent strike force. Officially described as routine, the mission is widely viewed as a message to Caracas, and by extension to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, that Washington is ready to act decisively in its own hemisphere. Venezuela has mobilized defenses leaning on Russian and Iranian support while China bolsters its economic ties. Globally, allies welcome the reassurance of US power, but fear overextension, especially as wars rage in Ukraine and the Middle East. Energy markets already reflect the risk of disruption, with oil prices climbing. Strategically, the deployment illustrates America's ability to operate across multiple theaters simultaneously, but also raises the risk of miscalculation. Whether this is deterrence or the opening phase of intervention remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Caribbean has re-emerged as a flashpoint in the global contest for power. Will this naval buildup remain a calculated warning or spiral into a conflict that redraws alliances and ignites a new war in the Western